Hello. Let me know if the audio is working. Just send a chat message. I don't even know. Looks like it's working on my end. That was hell. That was hectic. Sweet. Awesome. Thanks, guys. Let me see. Let's see. We've got Mega Riot, Captain, and Bobbert. Is Roxanne joining us today? Okay. Yeah, there's Roxanne. Okay, cool. Yeah, so a lot of flail just now. I have 3 different pairs of headphones, and none of them work on my $2,500 gaming laptop, so I'm currently using my MacBook. So Mac for the clutch on that one. So we'll go ahead and get started here. I'm going to set a timer just so I don't go too long on this. Let's see here. We can kind of keep an idea of how long we're going there. All right, cool. So this class is ad hoc based on the just problems of the schedule and everything that's going on right now with the whole coronavirus. So obviously we're working remotely, and I'm trying to kind of stream with you guys here. This book is the Aviation Instructor's Handbook. It is a book that I had to read whenever I was getting my CFI or Certified Flight Instructor for just flying civilian stuff. What you'll see here is this book was actually made in 2008. Now, if you take a step back and you're like, oh, you need a 12-year-old book, there's a lot of information in here that we actually still use. So I'm going to use this book as my slideshow, if you will. So if you guys have it, you can follow along, but I'm hoping that it streams clear enough for you guys to be able to read it. Looks like it's kind of wonky there. Let me fix that real quick. Stand by. All right. Should be a little bit more clear. Perfect. I'll make myself smaller since I'm not really the focus of this for today. There we go. All right. So essentially what we're going to be looking at is a lot of information that is taught to CFIs as they're learning to become instructors of just civilian flying. But it's not necessarily taught in the Air Force, which is pretty astonishing in my opinion. So kind of like an overview we're going to talk about. We're only going to kind of cover the first 2 chapters. In my opinion, those are the most important chapters of this book. And essentially the first one is on human behavior and the second one is on the learning process. And I believe that the learning process is actually the most important of this entire process. All right, I'm closing the chat because I can't watch you guys talk because it's going to distract me. So basically, we'll just go ahead and start rolling into the first chapter there. So the first one's on human behavior. So the way this book goes is it gives like anecdotal, just random theoretical examples of like a student and explains their process, their learning, and everything that they went through to try and help you understand and relate. And so I'm going to try and do that from a weapons school or just Air Force or even our Q4 perspective so that you guys understand like what that looks like from our point of view and why we actually care. So an introduction, basically this chapter just talks about human behavior. It talks about the learning processes and it talks about different things that explain how an actual student learns, how they understand things, and how you should actually talk to them or focus on how you're actually discussing information with them. So One of the examples here is it goes through and it talks about human behavior basically has certain needs and certain understandings and things that they require to actually function as a human, pretty basic stuff. But this starts to actually break it down. What you'll see is actually my handwritten notes that I wrote in here to kind of make sure I hit certain things. So one of the things that you'll run into whenever you're teaching a student is different personality types. So basically what you'll see here is the Myers-Briggs folks that created the Myers-Briggs test, what you guys are familiar with. Another example is going to be the 16 personalities test on what you guys actually found out about yourself and figured out that maybe you are an introvert or you're an extrovert, or maybe you like to kind of recharge a different way than other people, depending on how that actually came out. Some of you may actually not agree with your outcome, which is perfectly fine, but those personality tests are designed to help you understand your personality type as a student, but primarily in this case when you guys graduate as an instructor, so that you can understand how you need to work with other people. By understanding your basic like philosophical understanding of yourself, it'll help you understand how you can actually work with your student to ensure that you are, I don't want to say catering to them, but molding your instruction to ensure that you include their ability or capabilities of learning or receiving information. So down here, instructor and student relationship. So how does the personality type testing affect the instructors and students? So essentially, research has led many educational psychologists to feel that based on personality type, everyone also has an individual style of learning, and this theory working with that style rather than against it benefits both the instructor and the student. So if I have a student that likes to sit in the back of the class, likes to be quiet, it may not be in my best interest to be that teacher or instructor that just continuously calls them out or makes them kind of stand out or be proactive in a way that they are uncomfortable. And what we'll learn as we go through here is that discomfort actually, your discomfort actually leads to a lack of learning, and that's actually another part of this chapter here. So not only does personality type influence how one learns, it influences how you teach. So learning one's personality type helps instructor recognize how he or she instructs. So the instructors, all the RQ4 guys, we actually went through and did this test, and I know that you guys did as well, to try and figure out exactly what your personality type is and how you function as a person, to try and understand how each of us are different and what our strengths and weaknesses are. So for example, mine is I'm an introvert, but I've got some intellect, but I'm an asshole about it, right? So I understand that when I speak to people, I need to kind of temper how I speak to someone so that they understand that I'm not trying to be rude or abrasive in any way. That's how my personality happens. So I actively have to pay attention how I speak to people to ensure that I don't come off in some way, shape, or form that may be negative to the information or knowledge that I'm trying to give them. An example of a stark difference would be like Jester, for example, extremely nice all the time. So you can kind of tell that there's different parts of the spectrum, and everyone is in their own location when it comes to their personality and how they function. So by understanding how you as an instructor are as a person and how your student is as a person will allow you to be able to manage your instruction and change how you actually teach them big picture. So essentially they being the researchers came up with this chart here. Let's see if I can zoom in here. Came in with this chart that actually explains like each person outside of their personality has different needs as a human to ensure that they are successful or makes them feel like comfortable in how they want to do stuff here. Give me 1 second. Cool. So what you'll see here is at a bare minimum, people, just baseline people have psychological needs. So if those psychological needs are not met, they as a person will not focus on the next thing in the pyramid until those baseline needs are met. So if you have a student that is having issues with where they're living, if maybe they're going through something with their spouse and they're living in their car or something like that, I actually saw that in pilot training over in Columbus. There was a student pilot that was living in his car, And as he was trying to figure out where he was going to live and going through that process of a divorce with his spouse, he didn't care about anything else above that. Above psychological needs is safety and concern. So once I have the bare minimum just as my animal instinct to survive, then I want to be secure and have safety. I want to feel like I'm comfortable and I'm going to be able to survive as I go throughout. The next one up is love and belongingness. So that's going to be another bit of essentially ensuring that you have something in your life. It doesn't necessarily have to be a person, but it can also be a thing or an activity, things like that. It really just changes person to person, but love and belongingness, you can just do a broad stroke on that and just assume it's just a person-to-person type thing. Self-esteem is another one that is next on the list. So that's going to be building the person up and making sure they're comfortable with themselves so that they're comfortable enough to actually go forth and conquer with the information and knowledge that they have. And then above that is self-actualization, vitality, creativity, self-sufficiency, authenticity, and playfulness, meaningfulness. Essentially, just building them up and then them as a person, understanding what their role in life is and what they want to do. So what you'll see is human needs here are satisfied in order of importance. Once the need is satisfied, humans work to satisfy the next level of need. Need satisfaction is an ongoing behavior that determines everyday action. So if you guys look at the coronavirus and how things are going on right now, a lot of people are freaking out and trying to ensure that their psychological needs are met before they care about anything else. That's why people are panicking and they don't really care if they look stupid on camera because their baseline instinct is to just secure those psychological needs that they need to have. To relate that to a student, bottom line is whenever you're teaching someone and they seem out of place, they seem like there's a problem or something's going on in their life, this is the type of pyramid, this is the type of thing that you need to start asking and poking and asking those questions to see if there's something going on, if they are lacking something they need to ensure that they are happy and successful, things like that. That is kind of like the baseline of where you want to start. So just kind of going through here, kind of hit the highlights on these, but essentially psychological or biological needs, security, the psychological needs are met. Essentially security becomes active, they need to feel safe. Then belonging, they want to feel loved or receive affection or anything like that. Getting what messages from Gump. Then esteem, essentially you build them up to ensure that they feel they're comfortable. And this is critical whenever you're teaching students, that you're not continuously just giving them bad feedback or beating them down. You want to build them up, because if you don't have a positive environment, then it actually is negative to you, the learning there. Then cognitive and aesthetic, essentially just the types of learning, working all the way up through the pyramid there. And then self-actualization is essentially it's where people are driven. So if you think of like, I was born to be a pilot, things like that, that is a self-actualization. That's you as a person focusing on what you want to do in life, being problem-focused, incorporating an ongoing freshness of appreciation of life, a concern about personal growth and the ability to have peak experiences. So to be honest with you, you'll notice a lot of people in the military have a lot of pretty high self-actualization where they feel like they need to be successful and do the best they can. So as I have written here, this is critical for understanding a student's mindset. Bottom line, you want to ensure that the student is capable of having some kind of self-esteem and some kind of goal of what they're going to do to ensure that they are successful as they're going through life. So you as an instructor, you as instructors need to understand like what your actual student is trying to do and what their mindset is. And if you don't understand their mindset, then you're going to fail as an instructor because you're not meeting their basic needs, things like that. Human nature and motivation. So essentially, human nature refers to the general psychological characteristics, feelings, and behavioral traits are shared by people. There's a guy named Maslow. He created the hierarchy of needs, is what you saw there. But a psychologist of Douglas McGregor set out two different ideas and theories of how people actually work. And so theory X of one of them is people have an inherent dislike for work and will avoid it whenever possible. People must be coerced or controlled and directed or threatened. People prefer to be directed and don't want responsibility. Essentially, the lazy people that you are used to seeing, I wouldn't say used to seeing, but you should be familiar with in some way, shape, or form. That is theory X on how people are. I personally don't believe in theory X. I actually believe in theory Y, because I have a personal experience that teaches me that you can take someone that looks like they're inherently lazy and actually give them a goal, and they'll actually work towards it. So theory Y is work as natural as play and rest. People will exercise self-direction if they're committed to the objectives. They're not lazy. Commitment to the objectives is a function of the rewards associated with their achievement, and people learn to accept and seek responsibility. Creativity and ingenuity, imagination are widely distributed among the population, and people are capable of using these abilities to solve an organizational problem. People have potential. So this is, in my opinion, how people actually are. So I won't say his name, but I had a guy that I worked with. He worked for me in scheduling back in Grand Forks in the 348, and everyone thought he was lazy. Everyone thought he was a bum. Everyone thought that he just didn't want to work, that he just wanted to play video games. And I actually disagreed with them. I kind of saw through that. What I did is I gave him a job in scheduling that was focused on something he was actually interested in. He liked programming. So I gave him the responsibility of creating a new whiteboard for Grand Forks, and that is the whiteboard that's currently used at Grand Forks. So it was this guy that was the lazy guy that no one wanted to deal with. He actually created the scheduling whiteboard that is used at Grand Forks right now. So I firmly believe that as long as you give them some kind of direction and have them commit to an objective that they believe is something they enjoy, their creativity and ingenuity will actually come out, and they will actually be able to build something up that what they actually like, as opposed to being forced to do something they dislike. Now, that doesn't mean that lazy people can just get away with not doing work, but it means that if you can focus that energy towards something that they can be productive, that's a better way of utilizing someone. You should never look at someone as essentially just write them off. Figure out where their capabilities are, where they can be brought up to, and reach down and grab them and pull them up. And that really kind of just is a baseline on people in general. That's just kind of how that is. I believe this is really what was just in that picture there. So human nature, basically, it seems like it's human nature to be motivated, and the responsibility for discovering how to utilize their potential lies with the instructor. So this is critical. If you have a student that is just not really interested in tactics, but they're interested in all these other things, maybe you don't focus on tactics with them. Give them the bare minimum to be successful, but maybe you should focus their energy somewhere else to ensure that they're successful in another way. Everybody's different. Everybody has different interests. And so by doing that, it allows you to focus the areas that matter for that person, and then you'll get a lot more motivation from them to be successful. I'm going to go ahead and pause here for like 60 seconds. Do you guys have any questions so far? Just type it out in the chat. There's a slight delay if you're not aware of that. So it'll take a second for me to for you to see my answers there. All right, if there's anything, just let me know. I'm just going to go ahead and keep going. All right, cool. So for people, human factors that inhibit learning comes down to kind of defensive mechanisms is how it's broken out in this book here. Essentially, they can be biological or psychological. The biological defense mechanism is a psychological response that protects and preserves the person. So I'm sure you guys have heard fight or flight. So bottom line, whenever someone is just kind of introduced to a very stressful situation, they'll either run away or they'll turn and fight. But I think there's actually a third, which may actually be freeze, where they may just freeze in place and they have a difficult time functioning because they go into shock, things like that. But you can assume that fight or flight is really what it's kind of focused on at this point. Again, this is an old book, so some of the information there may be dated. An example of where this might occur is a student pilot is learning to land the aircraft, and which is used in the event of an engine failure for a helicopter. Emergency procedure training is necessary to practice as an outcome to a true emergency is directly related to pilot's ability. Essentially, the anxiety the student may feel when practicing such maneuvers is an example of fight or flight. So to kind of explain this as RQ4, is if you have someone who's having an inability to make a decision, if the aircraft is having an emergency, things like that, it's up to you to kind of figure out which defense mechanism they're throwing up and how to help them get through it. The instructor needs to recognize the student's apprehension about performing the auto rotation, the engine out in the helicopter, and help the student gain the necessary skill to feel comfortable. So the biggest thing here is understanding what is causing the defense mechanism to flare up and helping them get over it. If it's a lack of knowledge, or if it's some type of concern, or if they're scared, then it may just be practicing or showing them that it's actually not that scary, or there's some areas that they don't need to be as stressed when it comes to that. So Sigmund Freud introduced, I don't know, you guys tell me what that one is, introduced the psychological concept of ego defense mechanism in 1894. The ego defense mechanism is an unconscious mental process to protect oneself from anxiety and unpleasant emotions, or to provide a refuge from a situation. So the defense mechanisms that we have here are repression, denial, compensation, projection, rationalization, reaction, formation, fantasy, and displacement. And we'll kind of talk about those because these are actually very important when it comes to your students. You may have a student that's having an issue with their spouse, and they just may be snapping back at you, or they just may kind of be just very, I don't know, just very lacking in motivation, or they're uptight, or they just don't really feel like they're in it today. That is an example of kind of a defense mechanism you can look out for. So the first one there is repression. Repression is a defense mechanism whereby a person places an uncomfortable thoughts into an inaccessible areas of the unconscious mind, things a person is unable to cope with. So basically an example here is a student pilot may have repressed the fear of flying that inhibits his or her ability to learn how to fly. So just kind of pushing it down, trying to compartmentalize it and not bringing it out and actually thinking about what your actual problem is. If you are scared of flying, well, why? Let's talk about that and try and figure out what's going on, because that person may have repressed those memories and what is causing that, and you can help alleviate that concern. Denial is the refusal to accept external reality because it is too threatening. It's the refusal to acknowledge what has happened and is happening or will happen. So these are the type of people that are just trying to just say that this is fine, everything is fine, building 107 is going to not leak, things like that. So it's just people that are just denying what is actually going to happen. And what that does is it puts them in a position where they're unprepared to deal with reality because they've just been putting it off and denying it being a problem for so long. Compensation is a process of psychologically counterbalancing perceived weaknesses by emphasizing strengths in another area. So let's say you have a student that's really bad at, let's say, running the checklist. They may try to, during the checklist, try to give you a whole bunch of GK about each step or something like that to try and keep your mind off of them running the checklist poorly or not remembering what each thing means or things like that type thing. So the example here is, I'm not a fighter, I'm a lover philosophy can be an example of compensation. So if you see a student that whenever you're going through something with them, let's say like a lesson or a flight or some type of scenario-based training like tactics or something, and they start focusing on an area that is not really exactly what you're trying to focus on, it may be an example of them trying to compensate and hide something that they are not necessarily, great in. Projection is an individual places his or own unacceptable impulses into someone else. A person relegates the blame for personal shortcomings, mistakes, and transgressions to other, or attributes personal motives. So example is, I failed because I had a poor examiner, right? So it's not because I did poorly, it's because the examiner that was, or the check pilot or, evaluator in our case, was just a douchebag. That's why I failed. Things like that. Instead of me clicking or giving a go to, instead of clicking the button that says go around on a go around, things like that. Rationalization is the subconscious technique for justifying actions that otherwise would be unacceptable. When true rationalization takes place, individuals sincerely believe in the plausible and acceptable excuses which seem real and justifiable. So these people are, in my opinion, similar to optimists. They're not necessarily trying to get away from what's unacceptable, but they may trick themselves in their own mind that everything is fine or everything should be this certain way without actually taking a step back and looking at it objectively. Reaction formation is a person fakes a belief opposite to the true belief because the true belief causes anxiety. So this is, I'm not scared of flying, everything is fine, but I get on an airplane and I freak out. So things like that. So it's just a fake belief, basically just the opposite of what they're looking for. Fantasy occurs when the student engages in daydreams about how things should be rather than doing anything about how things are. So this is the type of person that really the type of student that says, man, imagine if I go out and I do my check ride and I do really well and I don't get any downgrades and I do all this awesome stuff. And then you snap back and you're that guy that's sitting at an FEB. That would be considered a fantasy. Displacement is the defense mechanism results in an unconscious shift in emotion, effect, or desire from the original object to a more acceptable, less threatening substitute. It avoids the risk associated with feeling unpleasant emotions and puts them somewhere other than where they belong. So basically just kind of trying to shift away from what's actually happening. So what I have underlined here is it may be difficult for an instructor to identify excessive reliance on defense mechanisms by a student, but a personal crisis or other stressful events is usually the cause. For example, a death in the family, a divorce, or even failing grade on an important test may trigger a harmful defensive mechanism. So this is pretty key here. So you're going to have students that react poorly, or you may have an audience that reacts poorly to what you say, depending on what's going on in their lives and what's going on in the squadron, let's say. There's a lot of stress. So you might need to take a step back and identify where the actual problems are before you can be a successful instructor. Says an instructor needs to be familiar with typical defense mechanisms and have some knowledge on related behavioral problems. So I firmly agree with this. So I'm willing to bet that all the guys that became instructors through the RQ4 instructor upgrade programs, whether it be sensor operator or pilot, you were not taught this type of stuff. And this is why I wanted to teach this stuff to you guys today, because you really need to understand how people function and how they work to understand how to teach them, instead of just doing a sim and then you didn't do the sim that great, you should do the sim better this way, and then that's being an instructor. That's not being an instructor, that's running a simulator. That's checking boxes on a grade sheet. That is not actually what you're looking for. What you need to focus on is actually understanding how the student is learning and how they can go from there, and we'll talk about that. Student emotional reactions can be a few different things. It's not necessary for a flight instructor to be a certified psychologist, but it's helpful to learn and analyze student behavior. So one is anxiety. Anxiety is probably pretty obvious to most everyone on how that works. The responses to anxiety range from hesitancy to act to impulse or something, even if it's wrong. So I personally have encountered this myself, where I've been pretty hesitant on making decisions in pilot training. There was a lot of concern for me in formation flying because I wasn't super comfortable in my ability to maintain the formation as well as I should have as a student, and so that caused me to be hesitant in some areas. I eventually got over that, but that was just an example of what that looks like. Normal reactions to stress. Basically, the adrenal glands activates hormones which prepare the body to meet the threat or retreat. Normal individuals begin to respond rapidly and exactly within the limits of their experience and training. So this is pretty interesting right here. What this tells a lot of people that read this is that if you can train someone really well in the PSAT, when the flight EP happens, they should theoretically function and do everything correctly as long as you taught them correctly. I can attest to this personally. I've experienced this more times than I care to admit. That essentially whenever shit hits the fan and you need to actually respond, that you will do things really well. But it's up to you as instructors to get them there to understand how to do that well. Abnormal reactions to stress can vary from different things. Basically, during flight instruction, instructors are normally the only ones who can observe a student when they're under pressure. So you won't see this when you're not flying. You may have like a ground event, or you're just chatting with the guy at the table, or you guys are just hanging out, whatever. You will never really see a person's stress and how they'll respond to it until they're actually put in the position of it being very stressful. Inappropriate reactions such as extreme over-cooperation, painstaking self-control, and inappropriate laughter or singing, or very rapid changes in emotion. Okay, so the tell for me on this is inappropriate laughter or singing. What I do as an abnormal reaction to stress is I will hum. And so Essentially, if I was flying a plane and I had a hot mic on and anybody flying with me could hear me humming, they knew that I was uncomfortable and that I was stressed. And I still do that even when I'm not flying. If I'm in a position where I'm trying to figure out what I need to do, I start humming. And it's not necessarily humming a tune, but I'll just exhale and just a humming nature, and I just use that to kind of slow down my breathing to help me relax and calm down. Marked changes in mood on different lessons, such as excellent morale followed by deep depression. So that's a good example of one that you guys will likely see a lot in the Air Force. And then severe anxiety, anger directed towards the flight instructor or service personnel or others. So, if you basically, if your rage increases over time as you're sitting in a lesson, or if you have a student that just continuously has problems with your instruction, or if they start to be just kind of apathetic about things, they're reacting to stress in a way that may be abnormal, and it may be time to kind of have a sit talk with them. Flight instructor actions regarding seriously abnormal students. So this book basically suggests that the instructor believes that a student may have a disqualifying psychological defect, arrangements. Basically, arrangements should be made for another instructor who is not acquainted with the student to conduct an evaluation of the flight. So this should be pretty common knowledge, but it's not. If you have an instructor that is flying with a student and identifies an area that is concerning, I believe we did this with one of our previous pilots, but basically you need to fly them with a few other instructors so that they can see the same thing and document it to understand what the really concern is there. And then again, this is FAA stuff, so it says that the primary legal responsibility concerns the decision on whether or not to endorse a student to fly alone. So if you have a student that you're not super comfortable with flying by themselves, then it's worth having the conversation and pausing it. Okay, so an area that is 100% not taught, but should be taught to us as Air Force pilots is teaching to adult students. While aviation instructors teach students of all ages, the average aviation student age is 30 years old, which means the aviation instructor needs to be versed in the needs of adult students. I guess we're adults now, some of us. Basically, the field of adult education is relatively young, and having been established in the late 20th century, the research reveals certain traits that need to be recognized in teaching adult students. So I would, as a 30-year-old, I would actually say that may be older than 30, since I read this before, and after reading it again, I think maybe this needs to be updated, or maybe I'm just old. I'll just stay over here. But adults as learners possess the following characteristics, and I won't go through every single one of these, but I want you guys to kind of write this down or go back and look at this book that I sent you guys, and definitely kind of have a look at this, because you'll realize that as young people, we're going to deal with older students, and even in the future, we're going to deal with older students. Maybe that's commanders that went through the senior officer course or things like that. It may be, something that you need to take a step back and look at. Adults who are motivated to seek out learning experiences do so primarily because they have a use for knowledge or skill being sought. Learning is a means to an end, not an end itself. Adults seek out learning experiences in order to cope with specific life-changing events, such as a marriage, divorce, or a new job. They're ready to learn when they assume new roles. One thing that you'll notice on here is adults are practical and focusing on the aspects of the lesson. Adults need to be shown respect. That's one of the key things there, but understand that there's no rank in the cockpit. And the need to increase or maintain a sense of self-esteem is a strong secondary motivator for adult learners. And then adults want to problem solve and apply new knowledge immediately. So as opposed to your younger audience who are just kind of slow rolling it because they are not in a rush, you will notice that older students, I've seen this myself, want to hurry up, teach me the thing because I want to go and fly by myself. And it's well, it doesn't work like that. We need to slow down because if I give you too much knowledge then too quickly, then you won't actually retain it. Instructors should provide a training syllabus that is organized with clearly defined course objectives to show the student how training helps him or her attain specific goals. And I believe that this is actually relevant to everyone, not just old students. Help students integrate new ideas with what they already know to ensure they keep and use the new information. So this is key here whenever you start looking at a positive transfer of learning versus a negative transfer of learning, helping them understand and apply and group up things that are new that they're learning with old things they know to try and help them understand a thing. So this is what I like to do with you guys, or with other students, just everybody that I teach stuff to, is I'll try and bring out analogies that are associated with something that you learn, but I'll take it slow to try and help you guys understand, or literally anyone understand a thing. I'll try to use something you're experienced in or what you have a lot of knowledge in, and correlate it or associate it with something new that we're teaching or I'm teaching to help you understand the thing. And then it's your responsibility only for his or her own expectations, not for those of the student. It is important to clarify and articulate all of student expectations early on. So expectation management is key here. If you actually ensure that the student understands why they're doing a thing and what the end result is supposed to look like, then it'll be significantly easier to teach an older student, because they'll understand that you're not just trying to rob them of money, and you're not slow rolling them to try and steal their money. And I keep saying that because I had an instructor in college who would continuously try to tell me that we needed to do extra stuff because he, in fact, was trying to get extra time to get more money. It definitely wasn't because I was a bad student. Yeah. Recognize the student's needs to control pace to start and stop time is another key there. Take advantage of the adult's preference to self-direct and self-design learning objectives by giving the student frequent scenario-based training opportunities. And we'll talk a little bit more about what SBT is. But bottom line, almost everything that we do in the Air Force is SBT when it comes to RQ4. So think all of your practicals. You had a scenario that you had to apply your knowledge to. That's considered scenario-based training. And then there's some more stuff on there that you guys can go through and read as required. So that's human behavior. That's kind of the key things there in Chapter 1. If I wasn't clear in the beginning, which I don't think I was, this class today is just going to be Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. And then we're going to go through a couple other chapters, and that's it for Wednesday. But one of the things to keep in mind here is that there's a lot of good information in here, but I don't want to sit here and actually just read you the book. I just want to hit the highlights on what I believe is important, so that you understand where you should focus your knowledge and what you're looking for there. So looking at Chapter 2, the next thing we're going to go into is the learning process. So I'll pause here for any more questions if you guys have anything. Am I coming through clearly? I can't hear myself when I'm speaking to you guys. It's like I'm just talking to the camera, which, I mean, if people get paid to do this, then YouTube seems like the way to go. Is the XY theory considered binary, or can there be a mix? With the XY theory, Roxanne, I believe that it's one or the other, but obviously it can be a mix. Everybody's different. I believe if you actually read this here, there are assumptions for theory X, but the guy that made it, he believed that these assumptions were false and that the role of instructors is to develop potential in employees and help them release that potential toward a common goal. So the guy that actually developed this doesn't believe that theory X is actually real or true based on what I'm reading here. It's actually, he believes that theory Y is true, and I actually agree with him. But obviously there are some areas that maybe aren't, there are some areas that may not match up depending on the person. Everybody's different. You're always going to have those people that don't match it. But bottom line, you theoretically could be one or the other, but I believe even the person that made this is actually focusing on theory Y and believes that to be the true one there. Okay, cool. All right. So the the learning process. So, guys, in my opinion, this is the most important chapter of the entire book. I think that I've actually shared some knowledge from this book with some of you, whether that be Rob, Captain, or even Mega and Riot. So a lot of the information and knowledge and in how I personally have understood psychologically how to teach people comes literally from this chapter. And so before we actually move ahead, I want you guys to kind of see some stuff and understand that what we're doing here in the weapons school is actually not just weapons school. So I'm sure you guys recognize this, but this is Bloom's taxonomy. This is in a book from 2008 for certified flight instructors. So not to humble brag, but while everybody was learning this on their first day of weapons school, this is something that I used to learn back in college. So also what you'll find in this book is the building block approach, how to make objectives or desired learning objectives, and how to measure those and why those are important. And we'll talk about those tomorrow. And also multiple instructional techniques. It also teaches you how to teach in a classroom versus how to teach one-on-one, things like that. So when it comes to actually what you're learning in the weapons school, it's not new. It may be new to you, which is awesome because we're finally getting this type of information out. But in my opinion, the Air Force should be teaching this to our instructors from the beginning. So let me go back up to the beginning here. So the learning process. Again, the way this book works is, the way this book works is it actually gives different examples and whatnot to help you understand how to relate some stuff, and I'll continue to do that to relate it to the RQ4 or the Air Force in general. So what is learning? Essentially, learning can be defined in many ways. A change in behavior of the learner as a result of experience. The behavior can be physical and overt, or it can be intellectual and attitudinal. Never heard of that word before. Someone look that up and paste it in the chat so I can know what the hell that means. The process by which experience brings about a relatively permanent change of behavior. The change in behavior that results from experience and practice and gaining knowledge or skill, or developing a behavior through study, instruction, and experience. So bottom line, learning is just acquiring knowledge and changing your behavior based on the experience that you have gained through that knowledge and whatnot. The effective instructor understands that the subject being taught, the student, and the learning process, and the interrelationships that exist. So an effective instructor also realizes learning is a complex procedure and assists each student in reaching the learning outcomes. So learning theory, again, I'll foot stomp. This is my favorite part of this entire book, is the framework for learning. It's research into how people actually learn gained momentum with the Swiss scientist and psychologist Jean Piaget, who studied development of children in the 20th century. Basically, they influenced how people learn, and they came up with ways on how things work. Attitudinal, relating to attitudes. Attitudinal changes do not just come out of the blue. Got it. So learning theory is a body of principles advocated by psychologists and educators to explain how people acquire skills, knowledge, and attitudes. Various branches of learning theory are used in formal training programs to improve and accelerate the learning process. Key concepts such as desired, thanks, Bang, for that WhatsApp message there. Key concepts such as desired learning outcomes, objectives of the training, and depth training also apply. When properly integrated, learning principles can be useful to aviation instructors and developers. Thanks, Roxanne. So basically, there's different ideas of how this works. Behavioralism is a school of psychology that explains animal and human behavior entirely in terms of observable and measurable responses to stimuli. Whereas the difference between that and cognitive theory focuses on what is going on inside the mind. So it's more concerned about how you are processing information instead of that just natural reaction and execution of a thing. So that's the difference between those two there. Early theories of cognitive learning were established by psychologists, insert the names. Basically, there's a lot of interpretations of the data, but it's led to many different models as well as catchphrases. So the way that I like the way this is broken down is it's broken out into like different ways of understanding how people understand and function. So when you get down here to Bloom's taxonomy, this is how you can actually define and develop how you're trying to teach someone to understand like how they'll actually receive that information. So bottom line, starting at level 1 is just baseline knowledge. From there, you want to just work your way out and understand how you can teach someone and how you expect them to respond to you. And once they are proficient in that first area, then they'll move on to comprehension. These are the ways in which people actually learn. And knowledge can be broken down into even just rote memorization, which is just defining or just memorizing a term, definition, a procedure, things like that, but not necessarily comprehending how it works or why, or even applying it to actual usage. So Bloom's taxonomy, this is actually a really good picture. I'll send this out to the chat. That way you guys can have a clean copy of that to look at later whenever you guys get back. But bottom line, Bloom's taxonomy, not just a weapons school thing, and it definitely shouldn't be new to how we're functioning as instructors, but from here, you finally have a chance to kind of take that and move forward and use that to your advantage to teach new people and make sure you develop your instruction better. Higher order thinking skills, or HOTS. I've literally have only seen this definition here in this book, so I would take that with a grain of salt. HOTS are taught like any other, well, let me just define it first. The constructivist theory of learning explains and supports learning of HOTS, which is commonly called aeronautical decision making. Bottom line, high order thinking skills is having someone actively make decisions based off of something that they have learned and making judgment or actually reacting to a situation based on knowledge that they have learned over time. HOTS are taught like other cognitive skills from simple to complex and from concrete to abstract. To teach HOTS effectively involves strategies and methods that include using problem-based learning instruction, authentic problems, real-world problems, student-centered learning, active learning, cooperative learning, and customized instruction to meet the individual learner's needs. These strategies engage the learner in some form of mental activity and have the learner examine the mental activity and select the best solution and challenge the learner to explore other ways, and the best solution, and challenge the learner to explore other ways to accomplish the task or the problem. So bottom line, if you guys take a look at how we've developed our course, just to give you an example, we use a lot of problem-based learning instruction, authentic problems and real-world problems, where if you think of your practicals, thinking of how to apply them to the knitter, imagine if we were actually focusing on a real-world military problem that we're focusing on, which you guys will encounter here soon, actually in a few weeks. You can start planning to real-world stuff instead of theoretical stuff like you do in your practicals. So it's a chance to step into a world where we're focusing on real things instead of theoretical things to help you learn. And then I highlighted here, it must be remembered that critical thinking skills should be taught in the context of the subject matter. So what that means is if you have a student that's just having a poor time making decisions, let's say in the aircraft they're flying and they can have a difficult time deciding whether to turn left or right. If you go drive with them in the car and you go to an intersection and you're like, hey, turn left or right, that actually won't work. That won't help them make a decision or be better because they'll associate that with the car. So whenever their brain starts grouping knowledge and information together, it won't be associated with the actual aircraft and decision making. It will be actually put over into the driving of the car. Learners progress from simple to complex, therefore they need some information before they can think about a subject beyond rote learning. And again, rote is just memorizing stuff. If the student does not yet have any subject matter knowledge, draw on the student's experiences to gain entry into complex concepts. For example, most students probably played on a seesaw during their childhood, thus they have a basic experience of how weight and balance work around center of gravity. So this, I know you guys weren't there for this conversation, but Riot, you talked about my analogies and how I compare things to things. This paragraph is where that came from. And just for everyone else to let them in on the secret, I was discussing with Riot previously about some my instruction and how I was doing things, and one of the things that he brought up was my analogies. An example was Matt Taylor asked a question about how it was emotionally going through the weapons school, and I asked him if he worked the stock market, which I knew he did, so I already knew that I could associate that with him. And I said, the way the stock market goes up and down, that is how my emotional response was going through course validation. Another example was if you're trying to teach how optics work, how EO, IR stuff works, I think I started using an example of a hunter looking through a scope and getting closer and further away from their scope on their rifle as a way to try and explain how the camera may shift or not shift, depending on if you're the Block 30 camera or not. So bottom line, use analogies in association with something that the student that you're teaching has already learned and understands to be able to learn something here. I think my computer that my Mac is sitting on here is going to space, so give me 1 second here. I've got my computer running in the background, running protein models to help try and fix the COVID-19 thing. All right, cool. All right, so that's HOTS. So then there's scenario-based training. And again, I have literally never heard HOTS pronounced ever outside of this book, so just for your essay. All right, scenario-based training. So scenario-based training is a part of HOTS. Essentially, instructional method and facilitates the enhancement of learning and the development of transference of thinking skills. SBT, or scenario-based training, provides more realistic decision-making opportunities because it presents tasks and an operational environment. It correlates new information with previous knowledge and introduces information in a realistic context. So I put EP of the day here because I believe that if you can take some information from what's your actual mission that you're going to fly and actually apply emergency procedures to it, it'll help them understand new information and a realistic context of the actual mission. An example of where this was successful is there was a student in Grand Forks who I was going to fly with, and then I was only going to fly for a few hours during a red flag, and then I was going to go home for the day, and he was going to bring it back and land. And so for the EP of the day, instead of just reading out of the book and just picking whatever day of the week it was or day of the month, I actually gave a scenario based on our actual situation. And the scenario was, we are currently at the knitter. We received some type of malfunction. Now we have to get back. Let's talk about the checklist. Let's talk about the radios. Let's talk about everything you're going to do. And then what happened is I went home, and I shit you not, he got that actual EP. It was Ingram, actually. I remember his name. So Ingram, I kid you not, actually did exactly as we practiced in our EP to alleviate the situation and land safely. So he actually did it based on our training. So it was a chance for us to use the operational environment and then correlate it with new information in the EP of the day, and then he actually executed it, which was pretty satisfying for me. Basically, SBT is a training system that uses structured script of real-world scenarios to address flight training objectives in an operational environment. So if you guys think about the new FTU syllabus and how they're executing stuff, this is why Bang rewrote the syllabus the way that he did, was he would like our students to fly on locals and use scenario-based training to teach them so that they can make mistakes and actually meet those objectives in an operational environment, but also make mistakes. He wants to give the opportunity for the instructors to sit back and let the student make mistakes throughout the flight to ensure that they can learn, as opposed to an operational mission where the instructor will intervene every single time because it's an actual mission. We want to ensure that that's successful no matter what. So that's an example for that. We only got about not much longer, guys, so just for your essay. I want to say maybe 20 minutes or so. Okay, so that's scenario-based training. So bottom line, you should always use scenario-based training whenever possible and instructing studs or students to ensure that they can associate what you're teaching them with the actual thing that they're going to do. If you teach them in separate, kind of segregated or just compartmentalized ways, they won't associate them together as well as they would if you taught them as one giant piece of information. Let's see. SBT scenarios help learners better understand the decisions they have to make and also help focus the learner on the decision and consequences involved. Yep, okay, so we beat the dead horse there. All right, perceptions. So how do people actually learn, right? So we talked about scenario-based training, but how do we as people actually learn things? And it's through our senses. Sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. I'm not sure how you're going to do taste, but I'll leave that one up to Bang. Psychologists have also found that learning occurs most rapidly whenever the information is received through more than one sense. So bottom line, there's different factors that affect your perceptions and how you can receive information. So basically what it comes down to, each person receives information differently, and each person actually uses their different senses. Some people may be visual learners, some may be oral, audio learners, and then some may actually be kinesthetic learners. I know that Bang's a kinesthetic learner. So kind of an example of someone, if you ever watch how he teaches or how he asks questions, that's an example of someone that's a kinesthetic learner. Factors that can affect perception, both internal and external factors affect an individual's ability to perceive. Physical organism, goals and values, self-concept, time and opportunity, and an element of threat. So we'll go through these really quickly. Physical organism is basically just how the person actually sees, hears, and feels. So if you have someone that's like sick, doesn't feel well, things like that, that's going to actually physically affect how they learn. Goals and values. Perceptions depend on one's values and goals. Every experience and sensation which is funneled into one's central nervous system is colored by an individual's own beliefs and value structures. So basically, goals are also products of one's value structure. Things that are more highly valued and cherished are pursued. So think of your crew objectives here. If I have a crew that has a goal or an end game, some type of thing that they're trying to accomplish, they're more motivated to complete and pursue the goal than a crew that's just going out there to optimize, collect. I'm still waiting for someone to tell me what that means. Self-concept is a powerful determinant in learning. A student's self-image described in such terms as confident or insecure has a great influence on the total perceptual process. If students' experiences tend to support a favorable self-image, the student tends to remain receptive to subsequent experiences. If a student has negative experiences which tend to contract self-concept, there's a tendency to reject additional training. I'm going to take these off, put the microphones on them, so if you guys can't hear me, let me know. Otherwise, I'm just going to leave those off there. Constant negative feedback equals bad. So basically, if you have a student that's just not doing well, I would highly advise throughout the process. So you should be very supportive. Guy or gal, whoever, to be better, regardless of how they're actually doing, to ensure their success is there. And just holding that information, that negative feedback, unless it's just like, oh my God, you're about to start Okay. I'll put these back on. I'll just repeat that last bit there. Self-concept is a powerful determinant in training. A student's self-image described as confident or insecure. So bottom line, if you have a student that is doing poorly throughout the process of a flight or something like a check ride, I wouldn't say a check ride, but just a flight in general, try to save the feedback for after the flight. You don't want to continuously give them negative feedback throughout the flight because it'll negatively affect their self-image, their self-esteem, if you will, and actually cause them to not learn because they won't focus on that. Time and opportunity. It takes time and opportunity to perceive. Learning some things depends on other perceptions. Yeah, I don't know. It's fine. I'll just keep it on my head here. Thanks, Roxanne. It takes time and opportunity. Learning some things depends on time. So if you have someone who is just having a difficult time learning, just understand that not everybody learns at the same pace. And also, if someone's doing poorly and you kind of just like shut them away, you're defeating them from the beginning without giving them a chance to be successful. Not everybody learns at the same pace, but more importantly, not everyone learns the same information at the same pace. So, for example, I may learn information on tactics really quickly, but I may learn mathematical functions on how those tactics apply very slowly. Whereas me and Bang may be reversed. Bang learns the math very rapidly, but he may learn the tactics a little slower than I do. So it just is, that doesn't mean that we're both slow learners. It just means that we need to understand that each one of us has a different way of understanding or receiving information. And then the element of threat. And I have this red underlined here. The element of threat does not promote effective learning. So key focus here. If you threaten your students, you're a shitty instructor. Bottom line. If you threaten your students, you will adversely affect their capability to learn. You should never be threatening your students with, if you don't do good with this, then you're going to go to an FEB, or if you do this poorly, you just suck, things like that, or I'm going to write you up, things like that, whatever. If you do that, you're not doing well as an instructor, and you need to take a step back and reevaluate what your plan is on instructing that student. Learning is a psychological process. It's not necessarily a logical one. So trying to frighten a student through threats of unsatisfactory reports or reprisals may seem logical, but it is not effective psychologically. All right. So last bit here on that stuff. A good instructor recognizes that behavior is directly influenced by the way a student perceives. The perception is affected by all these factors. Therefore, it is important for instructors to facilitate the learning process by avoiding any actions which may inhibit or prevent the attainment of teaching goals. Bottom line, save it for the debrief. If you have some negative information, something that you want to go over with them, smile, continue the lesson, continue trying your best to teach that student, but ultimately all of the negative stuff, unless it needs to be corrected in the moment, and that's not everything, it's not all-encompassing, but all of the big stuff, save it for the debrief. Okay, so another kind of method of learning or way of looking at things is insight. So basically helping the student understand how each piece of information relates to other pieces as a total pattern of tasks to be learned. So hashtag why do I care? So imagine if you are showing up to a program and you're sitting through classes and you're like, why the hell am I sitting in this class? You need to be given insight ahead of time as to why that matters, because it'll give you more motivation to pay attention and understand what's going on. Insight almost always occurs eventually, whether or not instruction is provided. For this reason, it is possible for someone to become a better electrician by trial and error, just as one may become a lawyer by reading. Instruction, however, speeds up this process. As perception increases in number, the student develops an insight by assembling them into larger blocks of learning. So I talked about how to combine things together. As a result, learning becomes more meaningful and more permanent. Forgetting is less of a problem when there are more anchor points for trying insights together. So unfortunately, to be a good instructor, you have to understand how people's brains work and how they understand things. And the way that our brains work is we'll create different blocks. I don't know, we'll call it the building block approach, if you will. They'll take little blocks of information and just put a lot of information in there, newly learned info, and they'll kind of anchor it down in your brain as an understanding of how you understand things work. Then you go on to the next thing, but you need to associate it to the previous thing, because that original first block that you had is a lot of information that can be moved forward and used to help people understand the next thing. That's why we call it the building block approach, is we're creating anchor points throughout the process and associating those blocks of learning together to help you understand. Part of an aviation instructor's job is helping a student acquire knowledge. And I just wrote neat there because that is such a neat concept. Basically, acquiring knowledge is just kind of bottom line. You as an instructor, you're trying to help a student. So one of the methods of learning there is going to be memorization. There's different ways of how knowledge works. Memorization, basically, you're just trying to memorize the steps, memorize the knowledge, memorize the GK. The problem is that you don't actually understand it. So the limitations of memorization becomes apparent when the student is asked to solve a problem or provide an explanation of something that is not covered by newly acquired knowledge. So this becomes apparent in check rides. I don't know how many of you have actually given check rides, but it's pretty blatant. And this is what's interesting, is that as a student, if you understood how this works, you'd understand that if you're just memorizing information, it'll become obvious to your instructor as you're going along. Let's see here. And then basically there's 3 phases of knowledge and what they have here. So basically, being exposed to a new topic, Beverly tends to acquire and memorize facts. As learning progresses, Beverly begins to organize knowledge to formulate an understanding of things she has memorized, and then progressing further, still Beverly learns to use the knowledge she has compiled to solve problems and make decisions. So bottom line, it's kind of like a 3-step process of memorizing and then understanding the concepts of how things actually work together. That is essentially what this page says. Okay, the laws of learning. This is where I make all of my money when I was a CFI because I understood this process, and this is what I've been trying to teach a lot of you guys whenever I get a chance. But essentially, one of the pioneers, E.L. Thorndike, formulated 3 laws of learning, and then the laws were universally accepted and applied, and then there were 3 more laws added after the fact. So the law of readiness, the law of exercise, the law of effect, and the law of primacy, intensity, and recency. So just to go through these, and I believe these are actually the end of the chapter and we'll be done. And then I'll talk about what we're going to do tomorrow. So the first one is readiness. The basic needs of a learner must be satisfied before he or she is ready or capable of learning. So if we go back to the pyramid, back to the things of at the bottom, I need food, water to survive. After that, I need a house to live in. And then after that, I want to feel safe and secure. And then after that, I want to feel loved. And then after that, I want to feel like people, or I myself, feel like I'm important and I matter. And then after that, it just goes up and up until you yourself feel like you want to be successful because you have all the things at the bottom of that pyramid. That's going to be readiness. That's going to be a law of learning there. And then effect. All learning involves the formation of connections, and connections are strengthened or weakened according to the law of effect. Responses to a situation that are followed by satisfaction are strengthened, and responses followed by discomfort are weakened, either strengthening or weakening the connection of learning. So this is key here. If you have a student that is doing really well, but a catastrophic event occurs, that law of effect may actually negate the learning. So imagine if you're in a situation, let's say you're flying and you've been teaching all the things that you're trying to teach to the student. You guys have been flying for an hour and a half, and then you go C3. Well, I can tell you that the student will only remember the C3 and all the things that you taught, at least by the law of effect, because that is going to be the thing, that catastrophic anxiety or response to that situation will weaken their ability to learn what happened outside of that catastrophic event. So just remember that if you have a student that has an event occur throughout the process of learning or your instruction, you should be able to identify up front if that student's going to retain that knowledge or not, and you need to circle back with them if something had occurred. Exercise. Connections are strengthened with the practice and weakened when practice is discontinued. It's literally just practicing. So chair flying, doing EP sims, things like that, that's going to be exercise. Primacy. Okay, so if you guys take anything from this section, I want you to remember this highlighted section. Primacy is the state of being first, often creates a strong and almost unshakable impression and underlies the reason an instructor must teach correctly the first time and the student must learn correctly the first time. For example, a maintenance student learns a faulty riveting technique. Now the instructor must correct that bad habit and reteach the correct technique. Relearning is more difficult than initial learning. I can't foot stomp, I can't beat the ground with a sledgehammer enough for you to understand that primacy is important as an instructor. So if someone asks you a question and you don't know the answer, you don't answer. Bottom line. Because if you answer with what you think is the answer or you just guess, you are screwing your student almost for the rest of their life potentially. Because primacy dictates that that student will learn that thing that you taught them and think that forever. I have things that I was taught by instructors that were wrong, and I can't unforget them. It took me 3 years to learn the difference between downrange error and cross-track error because one of the instructors that taught me what those were when I first learned it in the Block 40 taught them to me backwards. So I had to go through many years literally drawing them out and rewriting them because I couldn't memorize the correct answer appropriately. If you don't know the answer to something, either sit there quietly and stare or say, I'll get back to you, but do not make up an answer to make it seem like you're competent. Being competent is just showing that you know that you don't know the answer. All right, moving on to intensity. Immediate, exciting, and dramatic learning connected to a real situation teaches the learner more than a routine or boring experience. So imagine you guys are flying at Beale and you have a script running and it's really exciting. That's going to help you understand how the pilots and SOs are working together to solve that exact problem, as opposed to going out and just hanging out, not really doing much. So that is why we try to focus on giving you guys an exciting situation. Think Fun 1. Whenever you guys first did Fun 1 for the very first time, that is going to be an example of intensity. It was exciting to actually apply things. There was a little bit of drama. It was a kind of a real situation, what you'll see in the knitter, hopefully, unless COVID-19 puts it down. Things like that. Recency. Okay, so this is another important one that I stand by. The principle of recency states that things most recently learned are best remembered. Conversely, the further a learner is removed in time from a new fact or understanding, the more difficult it is to remember. So if you have someone that hasn't flown in a while, you need to understand what they may have dropped off their iceberg to understand what you need to focus on when you're teaching someone. So to give an example of myself, I haven't done a lot of just instrument flying in the RQ4. I would go as to say many have not, to be honest with you, but just basic flying, I have not done a lot of flying. However, I've done a lot of tactics. So if I go back to Grand Forks and I'm trying to get ready for my check ride, maybe a little less focus on the mission and more on the instrument side. That's what my instructor should focus on for me to understand that the most recent information is going to be stronger, and that's probably going to be the tactic stuff and less of the actual flying. All right, and then there's the domains of learning, and we'll just skip down to this right here. But basically, cognitive, which is thinking, affective, which is feeling, and then psychomotor, which is doing. And that is actually broken down into this chart here. Kind of make that expand a little bit there. So cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. So if you break that down into different sections, recall information, understanding, application, analyze, synthesize, evaluate, and then attitude, awareness, respond, valuing, organization, integration, and then psychomotor, observation, imitation, practice, and habit. So bottom line, there's different domains, if you will, of learning, and understanding how those are being applied by your student is going to be important for you. Another table here is the 6 major levels of Bloom's taxonomy for the cognitive domain. Is something that we've already talked about, but here's kind of a table view of Bloom's taxonomy that allows you to see and understand how things will go. So on the far right, you actually literally look like DLOs. If you actually take a step back and look at that, state the standard temperature at sea level, define a logbook entry, moving down to comprehension. In one sentence, explain why aviation uses standard temperature, describe something, and then determine when a logbook is valid or probably dramatized. Here's your application. And then analysis, compare what the different things are. So now you're starting to apply information there more in depth. And then synthesize. This may be you actually coming up with information as opposed to questioning a student on if a thing is right or meeting a certain DLOs. Maybe they have to actually create the information that you were discussing. And evaluate the importance of this information to a pilot, and then evaluating it necessary for keeping a logbook, so evaluation. So another chart here is learning is progressive, and they start at basic levels. So it'll start with rote, which is your basic memorization of how things are worked. They don't really understand it. Then they move on to understanding it, and then they apply it, and then there's a correlation of, let's say, integration for us. I can apply things now. Now I need to correlate them to other things, and I'll integrate with other people doing that. And skipping the stuff here. Summary of instructor actions. I don't think that's necessarily important for the psychomotor stuff, but you guys can go back and look at that stuff if you want to see it. Let's see here. So basically in the characteristics of learning, and I wasn't lying about this almost being done, but it looks like it's going a little longer than I expected there. We'll definitely be done in about 10 minutes though. Each student sees a learning situation from a different standpoint or viewpoint. So I want you guys to kind of remember this, that each person views from a different point of view, different angle, and students receive information the same way. So whenever you're teaching someone, understand that they may receive information differently, and so that's important for you as an instructor to understand how you need to teach someone. And then that appears to have just disappeared. And it looks like something was highlighted here, so that's exciting. I have the spinning rainbow wheel. All right, let me close this and open it back up real quick here. Okay. Let's see. Was this where we were? Yep. Learning is an active Learning is an active process. Learning style is an individual's preference for understanding experiences and changing them into knowledge. Yep. So that's one of the key things there. If you guys want to go through here and read a lot more of this stuff, please do. There's not a lot of stuff that I want to cover in the brief because a lot of that's going to be self-reading stuff. One of the key things I wanted to see here was the right brain versus the left brain. According to research, basically people have a preferred side of the brain that they actually use to learn information. That doesn't mean that they don't use both sides of the brain. It just means that they may lean towards one side more when actually receiving information, and that really defines how someone receives information, whether that be visual, audio, or even kinesthetic there. Just this chart here, left brain versus right brain, to understand like the differences of how people work. And once you understand how someone functions, how their brain focuses, then you as an instructor can focus on how you want to teach that person. And a lot of this stuff doesn't happen overnight. It actually just, it takes time for you to figure out what you can and cannot do because, sorry, I got something over there that distracted me. Basically, bottom line, it may take a little time for you to understand how your student actually receives information. You're not going to learn it in the first meeting. So this is why it's important for you to kind of build a relationship with your student more than just like, okay, we did this thing, we walked away. You need to get to know them just a little bit more to understand how they actually function as a person so that it can help you as an instructor. There's more theories here. I recommend you guys go check these out and just have a look. We'll move down to how different people are different learners. So as you can see here, visual, auditory, that's the word I'm looking for. Auditory and kinesthetic. So again, Bang is a toucher. He likes to touch things, whereas I'm a visual. I just like to watch. And then I don't know what Roxanne is. Roxanne, put whatever you are. And actually, everybody, put what you are in the chat. Let's have an interactive thing. Don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe. And you can hit me on my Patreon and all that other whatever bullshit people say. Visual learners rely on seeing to learn. They learn the best if a major component of the lesson is something that they can see. Whereas an auditory learner basically like to listen and speak. And kinesthetic people actually like to physically touch, manipulate, and then they like to do. So that's kind of how those people are. Moving on. Okay, there's different stages. You guys can go through and look at these. One of the areas I wanted to focus on was automaticity. It is one of the byproducts of practice. As procedure becomes automatic, less attention is required to carry them out, so it is possible to do other things simultaneously, or at least do other things more comfortably. By this stage, student performance of the skill is rapid and smooth, and students devote much less deliberate attention to the performance and may be able to carry on the conversation. So an example for this basically is for the RQ4. For me, was running the checklist. I became comfortable, and so just running the checklist very rapidly was something that I personally was capable of doing because I just learned it well enough that it just became easy for me to do while also simultaneously working the radios and doing all the other things. That was something that I was able to pick up on quickly. Okay, so one of the other things that I wanted to talk about here is plateaus. So if you look at this chart here, it talks about that everybody normally, if you don't plateau, then you're not normal, I guess is what I'm saying. Everybody has a different way of learning, and sometimes you'll hit a plateau. So what you're looking at there is the percentage of correct performance and then the periods of practice on the bottom. So as you can see, based on this chart here, I don't know what the data this is based on, but it's just an example. Between the third and sixth practice session, this person didn't necessarily progress any further. You're going to have students that plateau. You yourselves are going to plateau. But understanding what this looks like visually in a chart is important because it tells you that there's not necessarily like a dead end at the end. It still will rise up. You still will continue. What needs to change, though, is how you are teaching, the methods of instruction. So if you have a student that's having a difficult time understanding something, maybe they just won't get it that day. Maybe come back another day with them, work with them, and try to help explain it a different way, things like that. It may take time, but understand that everybody can get through that plateau. You just need to figure out how to help them get through it. And then there's different types of practice. You guys can go check those out. And then, okay, Overlearning of knowledge. This is something else I wanted to hit on here. Overlearning is the continued study of a skill after initial proficiency has been achieved. Practice proceeds beyond the point in which the act can be performed with the required degree of excellence. In some cases, the overlearning of knowledge has the advantage of making application of knowledge more streamlined and efficient. In other cases, development of automated routines can lead to problems. For example, a verbal checklist procedure becomes so automatic that a streamlined recitation of the checklist items becomes decoupled from the thoughts and actions of the checklist items introduced. So if you guys want an example of that, it's what's taught at water survival. Whenever you're under the canopy, they teach you, canopy, visor, mask, seat kit, LPU. Like, I couldn't physically tell you. I would literally have to take a minute to figure out what all those things mean, but they make you memorize that checklist. This is an example of that, is memorizing the checklist but not necessarily knowing how they apply. And then there's putting it all together. Still get more information, but not what I want to cover in this. Okay, so fixation and inattention. Fixation occurs when a student becomes absorbed in performing one task and exclusion of other tasks. Most of you as instructors should have seen this by now. With a new student, they may be focused on cleaning up that contingency planning and completely forget that there's an actual plane flying and they have to actually do all the things at the same time. Inattention occurs when a student fails to pay attention to a task that is important, and attention is sometimes a natural byproduct of fixation. So a lot of things that to keep an eye out for. You guys should be able to identify that at this point. And then also there's more information on scenario-based training. But one of the things I want to point out here is what makes a good scenario is a clear set of objectives. It's tailored to the needs of the student, and it capitalizes on the nuances of the local environment. So that can mean a lot of things, so you can kind of figure out how to apply that yourself and use it. One of the key things here that we like to say in the Air Force is, I don't know what I don't know. That's great. That's one of the things that actually is a cognitive strategy, which is the awareness of existence of unknowns. It's important to understand that you don't know the things you don't know. So therefore, you understand there may be a gap in your knowledge or a gap in experience that you need to focus on in the future and understand so that you can help others understand what's going on. And then from there, there's errors. So there's two different kinds of errors that they talk about in this book, which is slip and mistake. Slip occurs when a person plans to do one thing but then inadvertently does something else. That's pretty common. Sometimes it's not someone neglecting their ability or doing something wrong on purpose. It's just sometimes it happens. And one of the key things that we should be able to focus on as instructors is to understand that just because someone slipped and did something wrong doesn't mean they suck or that is like them as a failure. It just means that they may have made a mistake. You yourself have most likely slipped before. And then a mistake occurs when a person plans to do the wrong thing and is successful. Just saying that out loud is funny. One of the key things here is experts are not immune to making mistakes, which is sometimes arises from the way experts draw upon knowledge of familiar problems to respond to them by using familiar solutions. So an example of this is if you get a CDL 3 and 7 and you decide to just acknowledge it and not read the checklist because it's been the same for the last 3 years, well, guess what? They changed it. There's actually an LCP reset in there in the checklist now, so got you good. Don't be an asshole and make a mistake and not always check the first checklist or the first advisory that pops up. There's different ways of reducing error. Learning practice, taking your time, checking for errors, using reminders, developing routines, raising awareness, error recovery, and then learning from that error. So you guys can go through and kind of read through that. I don't want to focus too much on that because just as humans, we should be pretty knowledgeable about that, but otherwise, I don't want to cover too much of that. And then we are almost done here. Again, a lot of good information. I bet these pages, let's see if that page is important. Okay, again, talking about how the mind works. So again, as an instructor, you need to be a little bit of a psychologist to understand how the brain works. You can understand how to instruct. And I have an end of it here. There's different ways of retaining information. Transfers of learning, so that is going to be the positive and negative transfer. An example of that is a negative transfer is if I drive a car, the pedals don't do the same thing as if they do in the airplane. So if I have someone in an airplane that's trying to taxi, they may push the pedals thinking right means go, and they may turn right if they're in a smaller aircraft. So that's an example of a negative transfer. A positive transfer is I mean, literally, it could be playing video games on your Xbox and then going to a PlayStation and playing video games. The controls essentially do the same thing. So that would be a positive transfer of learning. And I think that we are done. Cool. Awesome. If you guys want to type up any questions, I'm going to explain to you what we're going to talk about in the next class tomorrow. Since I have a way of doing this now, we'll start on time. So tomorrow, what we're going to focus on, we're actually going to skip around a little bit because I don't want to go through each chapter in the book because I don't think those are important to actually discuss. What I want to focus on is certain things here. So we talked about chapter 1, human behavior, and then the learning process, and we talked about the different learning theory and the methods of learning. So those are important, I believe, for you guys to actually take a little bit of time to figure out. From there, we will actually skip around through a couple of chapters. One is the teaching process, because it actually teaches you how to prepare for a lesson, the trainings and objectives and performance-based objectives, how to actually define what you want your crew to do when you're flying, and also how to use instructional aids, how to teach in front of an audience, which I'm not going to cover a lot of that stuff because it's not necessarily important. Assessment, I'm not going to necessarily go through assessment that much. And then instructor responsibilities and professionalism, I don't know that I need to cover that. Planning instructional activity. So this can be one here where they actually use a building block approach and they talk about different things like lesson plans and whatnot. And then risk management is another one there. So we'll talk about just a few things tomorrow. I don't think it'll be necessarily as long as it was today. So unless you guys have any questions, that concludes my brief. And I'll hang out here, see if you guys type up anything. If you don't have any questions, just say no questions. That way I'm not sitting here staring at nothing. Or I can sit and stare at nothing. It's up to you guys. So the biggest thing I want is feedback. If you guys actually don't want to get another class tomorrow on this, on more stuff, then I will be glad not to teach it. I wasn't sure if this will be super relevant, but I feel like it's super relevant to everyone that's an instructor in the military because I don't feel like they teach this stuff, and it's good info to know. Just to kind of give you a comparison, every certified flight instructor that flies civilian world, they have 250 hours. Compare that to a pilot at an undergraduate pilot training. They all have 250 hours when they graduate. That's a year of training. They all have to learn this stuff and take a test on it. So it is called Fundamentals of Instruction, FOI. And it's required for all CFIs to actually become an instructor is to know this information. So compare that to how the Air Force actually teaches stuff. So I find it important, but if you guys don't want to get it, no judgment, no hurt feelings, just let me know. Let's see, so Mega says no questions, Roxanne nothing, Hook nothing, Bobbert nothing. Yep, no problem on the PDF. It'll be the same as, again, it'll be the same stuff, but we'll kind of jump around, but you'll obviously be able to see the pages on the screen as we go along. And then, yes, I wish you guys had seen this 5 years ago, too. Cool. All right, guys. Appreciate it. Y'all enjoy your time. And I agree, Ken, it should be cool. I agree that you guys should have learned this, but that's fine. That's why I'm trying to teach you guys right now. And you guys have this book to take back. It's PDF. It's free. You can get it off the FAA's website. It costs nothing unless you get the paperback version. But cool. All right, guys. Y'all have a good one. Smash that like button, subscribe, and